Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. So today I'm putting on my accounting analyst hat because we are going to totally demystify the often misunderstood world of public debt. And stick around because by the end of this, I'm going to reveal the ultimate formula for calculating a nation's true liabilities. You know, if you've ever stared at one of those national debt clocks just ticking relentlessly upwards and felt a massive wave of panic, well, this breakdown is exactly what you need. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. First, defining public debt. Then, public versus private borrowing. Third, sources and purposes. Fourth, repayment and timelines. And finally, the big one, gross versus net debt. Let's get right into it.
Starting us off with Section 1, defining public debt.
You see, just like you or me, governments actually have to borrow money when their spending exceeds their revenue. They do this to fund massive infrastructure projects or, just to cover unexpected deficits. But to really ground this kind of abstract concept, let's look at a textbook definition. The economist Finlay Shiraz puts it like this: national debt is a debt which a state owes to its own subjects or to the nationals of other countries. Basically, it just means the state owes its own people or foreign entities for the cash it takes to keep the country running.
Moving on to Section 2, public versus private borrowing.
Now, this is crucial. We absolutely cannot think of national debt the exact same way we think of our own personal credit card debt or a home mortgage. The power dynamics are just entirely different for a sovereign nation. For instance, look at compulsion versus repudiation. A government can actually force institutions within its borders to lend it funds. No private individual could ever do that. And get this, under highly abnormal circumstances, a government can completely repudiate or basically refuse to repay its loans. If you or I tried that, yeah, we'd be looking at immediate legal action and total bankruptcy.
Then there's the actual nuts and bolts financial mechanics of it. Because governments borrow primarily to spend on the welfare of society, and because they generally have incredibly high creditworthiness, they can lock in much, much lower interest rates. And how do they pay those loans back? Well, by taxing us, the people. On the flip side, private borrowers like us face higher interest rates because we're a higher risk to the lender, and we have to repay those loans strictly out of our own hard-earned savings. No taxing our neighbors to pay the mortgage, right?
All right, Section 3, sources and purposes.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that public debt isn't just one giant monolithic lump sum. It's a highly structured taxonomy based on exactly where the money comes from and what it's being used for. The source text beautifully categorizes this massive topic into 6 distinct binaries and timelines. We're talking short-term versus long-term, productive versus unproductive, internal versus external, and so on. Let's unpack a few of the most critical ones that actually dictate a nation's economic health.
First up, we have internal versus external debt. Internal debt is raised directly from individuals and institutions right inside the country. External debt, on the other hand, is borrowed from foreign entities. Think the IMF, the World Bank, or foreign commercial banks. So why does this matter? Well, paying interest on foreign debt actually reduces a debtor country's national income because it transfers that wealth abroad. Internal debt, however, keeps the money circulating right within the domestic economy, which really minimizes the overall economic burden.
Next, we have to look at what the money is actually buying. This is productive versus unproductive debt. Productive debt pays for projects that yield income. Think railways, power plants, heavy industries. The beautiful thing here is that the income earned from these projects literally pays for the loan's interest and principal. It pays for itself. Unproductive debt, however, funds things like wars or just covers ongoing budgetary deficits. It yields absolutely zero income, it doesn't add to the economy's productive capacity, and frankly, economists consider it a dead weight upon the government.
Which brings us to Section 4, repayment and timelines.
So knowing where the money comes from is only one half of the equation, right? The other half is knowing how exactly the government structures the actual payback process across different time horizons. Governments usually issue debt across 3 main buckets. Short-term floating debts, like treasury bills, are for periods up to 1 year. Medium-term debts range from 1 to 5 years, and long-term debts extend beyond 5 years, and those act very differently in the financial system than your quick, short-term commitments.
Now, an incredibly interesting distinction highlighted in the source material is redeemable versus irredeemable debt. Redeemable debt is exactly what you'd expect. It's repayable by the government after a fixed period of time. But get this, governments can actually issue irredeemable debt, where the principal amount is never refunded. Literally never. They simply pay interest on it forever. Naturally, repayable loans are heavily preferred to avoid having this permanent financial burden hanging around. And that brings us to the distinction between funded and unfunded debts. Unfunded debts are short-term, and the government doesn't create any separate fund to repay them. But funded debts, those are long-term obligations. To repay them, the government creates a specific dedicated account called a sinking fund. Money is deposited into this sinking fund every single year to prepare for the debt's maturity. And this concept of a dedicated repayment fund leads us perfectly into our final and honestly most important analysis.
The grand finale, Section 5, gross versus net debt.
Okay, keeping those accounting analyst hats on for a minute. How do we cut through all this noise and find out what a country actually owes? Let's look at the real balance sheet. It all starts with gross debt. Gross debt is simply the sum total of all the outstanding debts owed by the government at any given time. When you see a terrifying number flashing on those digital debt clocks in the news, you are looking at the gross debt. It is the absolute ceiling of a government's liabilities, presented entirely without context.
But here is the ultimate formula for calculating a nation's true liabilities. Net debt. Net debt equals gross debt minus sinking funds and loan repayment assets. That's it. By deducting the money the government has already actively set aside in those sinking funds to pay its debts, we finally strip away the panic. We reveal the true, accurate financial burden of a nation. It's all about the real balance.
So, considering all these classifications, from productive investments to dedicated sinking funds, how much of your own country's reported total debt is actually true net debt? The next time you hear an alarming headline about national liabilities, I challenge you to look past the gross debt, remember this formula, and investigate your nation's real balance sheet. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the numbers.